Hi, class. I wanted to talk to you as we go into week 3, and we have been focusing on reading chapter 1 last week. I really enjoyed reading all of your discussion posts. Thank you so much for putting so much time and energy into those. I did read every single one and I did comment on all of them. So if you haven't already, go back and take a look at my comments. That is how you learn. That's how we interact in this course. Since it's not an in-class course, I can only comment on what you give me. But that is ways that you can learn and you can kind of see what my thought process was as I was reading your post. Also, go back and read those, but go back and read your peers' posts. You can learn a lot from each other, different perspectives, different ways that each other answered the question. So it was really hard to find a bereavement card that actually used the words death and dying in them. And of course, that was done intentionally because I know that society doesn't use those words like death and died. And interestingly, I noticed that in all of your posts, more than half of you, most of you really, couldn't even use the word death or dying in your posts. You used words like passed away or lost. And if you can start to understand that that language is just not useful when we're talking about death and dying in our clinical perspective, in our context as social workers, when we're working with individuals, whatever the age, it's really important that we start using that language like dead and died, and start changing your mindset to understand that it's not about being insensitive. That is not why we use that language. It's also not insensitive to be using the words like death and died because reality, this is what happened. Someone died or someone is dying. During my time at the hospice house in Arcadia where I used to work, a lot of times family would come in to visit their loved one that was there, our patient, and the family would not know, okay, is this person dying? Or is this just they're coming here to get better and they're going to go home? So as the social worker on the team, my job was to help them understand that yes, this is end of life that we're seeing here. These are some of the end of life signs that are normal. But with that, if I chose to use language other than death or dying, would that really help the family to understand that this is death, this is dying, this is what we're talking about, this is end of life? And I don't know. I don't think that families who don't hear that real language, I don't think that they do truly understand, because when we flower it up, that's what they hear. They hear hope. They hear, oh, there's a possibility. But when we're talking about dying people, they're dying. We're not losing them. They didn't expire. They're not milk. Okay, we cannot use that language, especially when we're working with people, our clients, to help them through this time where we're now talking about dying and all that anticipation, but then we're going to be talking to them on the grief side. And how are we going to help them grieve properly if we can't even use words like death and died? So I'm going to challenge you for the rest of the course, throughout all of your discussion posts. I really want to see you using language like death and died. I don't want to see this person was lost, this person passed away, this person's in a better place. I don't want to see that language because it is not what is a best practice for us as clinicians and us as social workers to help our clients, okay? If you have thoughts on that, please comment back to me and let me know. I'd love to discuss it, but really what I'm trying to get across to you guys is this is the best practice. So let me give you some examples, right? Because as we're talking about in chapter 2, we're really talking about how do we, human beings, how did we learn about death and dying? What was the very first moment in our lives where we learned things, living things, animals, plants, people, that we all die? When did we learn that? And it's interesting because in this chapter, they really go over all the different possibilities, even talking about toddlers and infants and how they learn about death and dying. So question for you guys. Can infants and toddlers grieve? What do you guys think? Because a lot of people in our society don't believe that infants, babies, toddlers, that they are not even competent enough to grieve or to know that someone has died or a death has affected their family. Well, I'm here to tell you that if you can love, you can grieve. So babies, infants, and toddlers, they all grieve as well, okay? So imagine a baby being born and maybe their mom dies at childbirth. Now, of course, a baby can't verbalize to you that I'm missing my mom, I'm missing my mom, where's my mom? But where is mom, right? That mom is not there to provide the nurture and the care. She's not there to feed baby. And so child knows something's wrong here, something is missing, and something doesn't feel right. So yes, infants, toddlers, and babies can all grieve, and they all are aware that something bad has affected their life when there's a death like that. Take it a little step further. The chapter really went into depth about all the ages, right? We're looking at Erikson and Piaget and the differences. But what I really wanted you guys to take away from this chapter is that every developmental stage affects children and their ability to grieve or comprehend death or process death differently. So if we're looking at the youngest group, right, they require a lot of knowledge. They want to hear you say those words. So again, going back to hearing death and died, we have to use concrete words like death and died, because otherwise the littles, they take our words literally. Okay, so they are concrete thinkers. So if we use words like, I lost my dad, the child is going to simply think that your dad is hiding. Maybe we're playing hide and seek and he's lost and we're going to go find him. I once was at a community event. I was providing a booth to the community about my children's grief center. And I had a volunteer with me who was not trained by me, just a volunteer helping out. And what we were doing was we were asking community members, kids and adults, to come up to our booth and to create cards, inspirational cards, or I'm thinking of you cards for the children that were in our program that were grieving. So the volunteer next to me said to this child that came up to our table, was not a grieving child, just a child in the community, said to the child, would you like to create a card for a child who lost their parents? I didn't correct the volunteer. I kind of wanted to see how it all played out. Well, when I looked at the card that the child had made, it actually said, I'm sorry you lost your parents. I hope you find them soon. So, and that really hit it home for me. I mean, that was a teachable moment. I was able to take that card and kind of show to my volunteer, like, this is why the language we use is so important. And so now this is an example about kids, right? This same language, this same example applies to adults as well. When we don't use language like death and died, it really doesn't show that we understand that something bad happened, that this person died. We are acknowledging that that person has pain because someone died. We're not acknowledging someone has pain because they're lost. Do you guys see the difference? It's really important that you get this concept, because in the world that we live in, as was evident in the bereavement cards, people are not comfortable with that language, the death and died language. So we have to help them to become more comfortable. If you and I can begin using language like death and died, that will help the rest of the community to start doing so. So in our everyday lives, when we're communicating, I'm using language with my dad died. I'm working with a child whose mother died. Not I'm working with a child who lost their mom. Do you guys see the difference? So going back to the textbook, it was really interesting. I loved the examples they used when they were talking about how children learned about death and dying. And interestingly, I use that a lot in my everyday practice when I'm working with kids, because I want to see when was the earliest time that this child that we're working with learned about death. So for instance, when you see kids, if you have kids, if you're working with kids, kids learn from a very young age how to be gentle to animals, right? Pet the dog nicely. We have to be gentle to the dog. Little boys, they like to find the lizards. So they get the lizard and you're telling them, don't squeeze the lizard, you'll kill the lizard. Things like that. That language that we use where we're trying to educate them on life, being gentle to life, or it'll die. Same goes with plants. We have to water the plant so that it doesn't die. And I loved the example in the textbook when they were talking about the little boy in the middle of the night who wanted his sugar water, his milk, and he was feeling like he needed that fuel to recharge his batteries, because he had learned from his dad that cars need fuel for their batteries so that they don't die. And if you think about that language that we talk about, with kids and with adults, and kids hear us, they pick up on those things. And so that kind of impacts their knowledge and their way of processing death. So I thought that was a really interesting point that they showed in the textbook. And I thought it was a really good reminder for us that our language is so important to kids and to adults when they're grieving or going through the death and dying process with family members. So I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about how media plays a role in our grief and in dealing with death, right? So a lot of you also mentioned that in your post for chapter 1, but it goes to this chapter 2 because, again, how are we learning about death, right? So if you think about kids and going up to adolescence and to teens, we learn about death because we see it on TV or in movies. Or if you think about kids in cartoons, the boulder falls onto the cartoon flattens and pops right back to life. That's just not realistic. And so it's our job as competent adults in children's lives to educate them on those types of things. So same with teens, right? So teens are playing video games when they're shooting each other. And of course, it's just a game. But what are we teaching teens and kids about video games, about shooting, about death, that maybe very well could be retained in their information for later on? Are they understanding that death is final and it's not just you get another life to try again? And so those are the types of things that we need to keep in mind when we're working with kids and teens, because every aspect of their lives comes back to the way they are grieving or processing the death, really. Okay, so I also wanted to talk to you about how a death affects a person. So the way we process death really is multifaceted, right? So the relationship that someone had with the deceased person can affect their ability to grieve or their ability to process the death. So was that relationship strong? Was it severed? Was there some issues there? Did the person live in another state, or did the person live in their home? All of those things plays a huge role in how people are going to grieve and how people are going to understand the death or the grieving process. So likewise, how did the person die? Was the death about a stigma like suicide or drug overdose? Those deaths are difficult because of the community and the culture and the society putting all these stigmas on us when we're grieving, or when someone dies in that manner. It really creates an even elevated level of grief, right? When it's suicide, we're really talking about all of this mean and bad energy that's put on that person. But really, for us as clinicians, our job is to help the griever to understand that it's not about how that person died, it's about the life that they lived. And so, for instance, I was working with a teen, her twin brother died by suicide, and she really struggled with, I don't want people to remember him for the way that he died. I don't want people to remember him and think of him as a coward or for giving up. I want them to remember the beautiful man that he was and the kind and giving person that he was. And so we talked about that for a long time to really process, like, it's not about how he died, it's about how he lived and the impact he had on the world. Someone's death is only this much a part of their life and a part of their story. But it's our job as clinicians to help our clients to understand that people's lives are so much more than the way that they died. So keep that in mind too, because that affects the way people grieve and the way people process death. So on top of that, you have, going back to the way people die, car accidents are a big one, especially when you're working with littles. So in the book, they talked about some pictures. They showed some pictures of funerals, of kids that drew funerals, of kind of what they remembered or what they saw. There was also a picture in the book of a child who saw his brother get run over by a truck. And that really reminded me of a small child that I worked with, 5 years old. He was in a really, really bad car accident with his mom. The mom died instantly in the car accident. The little boy was in the back seat, and the mom, on impact, actually got pushed to the back seat. So you can imagine, little boy in the back with mom, her head is right there by him. Her whole body got pushed back, but there he can see her face, and he's asking for her. Mom, why aren't you answering me? terrified and scared. And of course, the police came and helped them, but mom had died. And so when I worked with this child, he really needed to repeat the story over and over again. He drew us a picture of it, and that really reminded me of him in the book when I saw that picture of the car accident where the car had run over the little boy, because this is what kids do. Their natural language is play, art, right? They're trying to act out what happened so that we can understand, so that we can have a clear picture of what's going on in their mind. If you think about it, they're overwhelmed with all these emotions and feelings that are coming at them, right? So they're feeling scared and worried and wondering, like, what happened to mommy? And why did the car hit us? And why am I alive and mommy's not alive? Right? And so kids have to write and draw and color and talk and tell us their story so that they can process it. And it's our job to be able to process that. Now, how do we do that? We can talk more about this later at later chapters, but I think it's really important to remember that our job is not to have all the answers, okay? We cannot have all the answers. We never will know why someone died and why someone lived. We'll never know any of that, but our job is to validate and support them and be there for them. Simply to be that sounding board where they can process their story, and we can hear it and create that safe place so that they can talk about it, okay? So I want you to also consider how adults talk to children about death, okay? So adults are sometimes worried about telling kids the truth about death. But as we, again, looked at Erikson and Piaget, looking at how different milestones affect the thought process, having a death at different ages really does affect the long term and their growth and their ability to process. So again, we're looking at is the parent or is the adult in the child's life able to verbalize how someone died in an honest, open way? So for me, when I'm working with my grieving kids, I really encourage the parent to tell the child as much as they can, age appropriately. So again, going back to the science of the body, right? So one of the best ways to explain death to kids when it has to do with bodily organs is to focus on the organs. So if the person had a heart attack, I try to do movements, right? So here's the heart, and it's beating, 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 and then all of a sudden it stops. And then when the heart can't beat, it can't pump blood through our body, and then our organs shut down, and then we die. So do you see how very specific words, even movements, even maybe visual pictures will help? And I promise you, every time I've done that with kids, they're pretty much like, oh, okay, very matter of fact. And that's because they simply want to know what's going on, and they just need you to tell them so that they don't have to have their mind wander to a place where it's like, oh my gosh, this horrible thing happened. And now they're thinking of the worst when really it was something that wasn't that scary, right? So we have to help parents to be understanding that there is a proper way to educate kids on grief, educate kids on dying. I have a lot of parents who suffer and who really have pain when they have to tell their kid about a suicide or about a overdose. And in our language, again, we have to really be mindful of the words we use with overdoses, with suicides, with murder, but also with old age. So if you think about it, oftentimes people are quick to say, well, they were really, really, really old when they died. Okay, so when I'm really, really old, am I going to die too? Or they were really, really, really sick when they died. Oh, great. So when I'm really, really sick, I'm going to die too. Or mom, when you're really, really sick, you're going to die too. So we really have to be mindful of the way that we use language with the littles, with any age, so that they don't get scared that something bad will happen to them too the next time they're sick. Or overdose, right? If you say, well, they took a lot of medicine and died. Well, now the next time I have medicine, am I going to die? So it's about using that proper language. And I'm bringing these up now because I want you to start thinking about how all of this plays a huge role and why our language is so important. Why I asked you about the death and dying card. Because I want us to start using the proper language. Same goes with suicide, right? So if you're telling a child, I have a child in one of my groups at my grief center that his dad died by suicide. And so when you ask him how his dad died, he'll tell you his brain was sick. Now, isn't that a perfect way of describing why his dad died? His brain was sick. He's 6 years old. Is it appropriate for him to know that the dad shot himself? Probably not. Right now, what's age appropriate for him is that his dad's brain was sick and he died. And as he grows up, his mom will share more with him. But at age 5, age 6, that's what's appropriate at that time. Yeah. All right, so that is a good amount of info for now. I want you to read chapter 2 and really learn from the different categories in the chapter. Okay, a lot of good stuff was in there. I'm just looking at my notes to see if there were some other things I wanted to go over with you. I guess the other topic that I just wanted to touch on is magical thinking. So just remember that with little kids, they think that this person's going to come back. So oftentimes it's a child asking, where's mommy, where's mommy, where's mommy? And the dad has to constantly say, remember, mommy died. And that can be really painful for the dad or for the guardian that's involved. And so it's our job to, again, support them, provide them with that education and understanding that this is normal for the child to respond that way. We just need to work with you to make sure that you have the proper response as well. Okay. All right, so please reach out to me if you have any questions about the chapter, but I did want to just talk to you a little bit about your discussion post, okay? So because this chapter is all about when do kids and people really learn about death and dying and grieving, how does that even come to be? I really want you to focus on you for a few minutes, right? When was the first time you learned about death and dying? Did you experience a death as a child, and that kind of was your first insight into death and dying? Did you experience a pet death? Do you recall your parents educating you on being gentle with the dog, don't squeeze the lizard? Do you remember those things? Do you remember having a pet, a class pet, and then it dying, and then the class had a conversation about it? I want you to think about your own personal experience about the first time you talked about death or learned about death, if you can. And I realize that I'm asking you to be pretty personal, so I really appreciate that. But I think it's important for us to examine and really understand, how do kids learn about death? How do people learn about death? And kind of what did we learn at that age, and then what do we know now? And did as many of you have shared, you've all mostly have had a loss, a death of some type. So I want you to think about, okay, did that death or loss that I had impact me as a child? Did that affect how I am doing now as an adult? And do I have a better understanding of death and dying and grief because of it? Okay, so I will share with you a little bit about my story. So my dad was diagnosed with thyroid cancer when I was 10 years old. And that was really the first time I had ever learned about death. I guess I had learned about it in school because I went to a Catholic school and we talked a lot about that. But I don't remember that before my dad dying at the age of 10. So I do remember going to school one day while my dad was sick in the hospital, and we learned about hospice at school. Whatever we learned, I don't know, but what I took away from that lesson was hospice is where you go when you're ready to die. And I came home from school that day, and my mom said to me that your dad is going to hospice. And I remember just losing my mind, completely shattering everything that I had hoped, because I had been praying, because I went to this Catholic school, and I had been told, okay, if you pray about it, your dad will be saved. And then to come home and find out that my dad was going to hospice, it was really difficult for me to understand without anyone actually educating me that yes, dad was dying. There was nothing we could do. There was no treatment that was going to help him anymore. And so when he died, that was just the most traumatic day that I can recall. But it was that whole experience that kind of set me up for death and dying for the rest of my life, because shortly after that, our family pet died. My grandfather died. My best friend died from a heart attack when we were 16, and so on and so forth. I've had many, many family members die. I think I have more family members that have died now than I actually have alive. So I think that experience at the age of 10 really, really set me up for understanding death and dying, and of course, ultimately being able to do this job. I've taken that aspect, that tragedy, that horrible thing that happened to me, and I've turned it into a purpose. Not everyone can do that, and I'm not encouraging you all to do that. I'm just sharing with you a little bit of my story because I think it's important, since I'm asking you to share with me about your story too. So please go ahead and post that in the discussion post, and please be sure to comment on each other's. I'm not grading you on if you're commenting, but again, if we were in a regular class, you would be commenting on each other and you would be talking. So try to do that if you can. There will be some other materials in the discussion post for you to look at, so feel free to do so. In the meantime, reach out if I can help you at all. Thanks so much. Bye.